Hi there, my name is Sifiso Falala. I am a representative of the African Genius Awards. Welcome to what promises to be a very exciting session today. I'm joined by Cuthbert Ncube, who is the Executive Chairperson of the African Tourism Board. Welcome, Cuthbert. I look forward to this discussion. As the African Genius Awards, we represent a number of interests, but we stand by our 5 pillars, which are our problem-solving skills. We believe that it is common knowledge that Africa is the poorest continent in the world, but not by the number of resources or the extent of resources that it has. If one takes that into account, Africa then becomes the richest continent in the world. And the reason for having the African Genius Awards and African Geniuses is to understand and to try and unpack that conundrum that faces the continent, that being the poorest and also the richest continent in the world. How is it possible to have this apparently contradictory scenario? Our second pillar has to do with global competitiveness, where through years of conditioning, we find ourselves in a situation where we think it is unethical or taboo to compete with the rest of the world. And the African Genius Awards is there to actually communicate the message that not only is it productive for the rest of the world for Africa to be competitive, but it is something that can help the rest of the world, simply because then we won't need as much aid. We won't need as much relief and grants in order to function as a society. And the third pillar is self-love. We believe that expressing self-love, being proud of our identity as Africans, is more than just saying that we love ourselves, but it needs to be expressed in what we do. The fourth pillar is patriotism, loving the continent, loving its people, loving everything about ourselves as well as the place that we live in. And the fifth pillar is organizing success. One of the things that we have noticed is that it is incredibly difficult and rare to find groups of people that organize successful events, especially those of a commercial nature, those of a productive nature, such as in problem solving and global competitiveness, such as in manufacturing, industry, and commerce. And so those are the 5 pillars. And I am happy to announce that we have partnered as the African Genius Awards with the African Tourism Board, of which Cuthbert Ncube is the Executive Chairperson. And thank you, sir, for gracing us with your presence. And perhaps briefly, you can, given that context, explain to us what the African Tourism Board is. What do you guys do? What is your reach as far as the continent is concerned? What are the aims? What is the mandate of the African Tourism Board? And then why is it important for you to have this partnership with African Genius Awards?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate, very much honored for the first time to come and sit side by side with champions whose objectives is to see how best you are positioning the continent, and also in accelerating the notion that if there was a time where Africa should stand and position themselves and identify themselves on who they are. As African Tourism Board, our task and our objectives is to see how best can we tell a good story about Africa. In your opening remarks, yes, you said that Africa is the poorest, but Africa is the richest. When you look at what God has actually endowed upon us, we strongly believe that Africa can be a powerhouse of the global community. What we are advocating as African Tourism Board is to say how best can we position, how best can we dismantle the barriers and the borders that has separated us as a continent. I think fundamentally that's where it should actually start. once we start to appreciate on who we are, our identity, we need to know our identity as Africans and move away from the dependency syndrome. I've always said all 54, most probably out of 54 member states, I mean, almost 95%, they experienced hardships under the yoke of our oppressors. And they realized that, look, the fight, they could not actually stay in the kitchen. It was too hot. They gave us political independence, but they withheld the economic independence. That's why now when you talk about the World Bank, it's all about when they give these aids, when they give us so much money, so that Africa still remains dependent upon them. So as African Tourism Board, fundamentally is to say, how best can we tell a good story about Africa? How best can we tell our own story, our own narrative? As we were coming, we were discussing about the issues that prevail in Africa. Yes, there is no country that does not have its own challenges. I have always said, when you look at America, from the broadest sense, they have places where you cannot visit those places. So that's where the media fraternity comes to play a pivotal role. To say, how do we tell a good story about the continent? How do we start to come together, as I indicated, that we need really to dismantle the stereotypes that we have, where we think that the best comes from Europe, where we think that, when you talk about from the tourism perspective point of view, when we talk about tourists, we think of somebody coming from Europe or something from Asia in that case. So we are saying as Africans, we have been tourists long before the white people came to Africa. When you look at, if we go beyond, when you look at I managed to go to Durban during the Kaiser Chiefs playing there. That's tourism at its best. That's sports and tourism. So simply because these are endeavors from our African initiatives, we are not actually regarded as one of the continent that can bring value. So yes, as African Tourism Board, our task and our objectives is to say, how do we tell a good story? How do we start to appreciate who we are? How do we start to develop our own mechanisms from the educational space to develop so that we start to stand on our own 2 feet?
That's amazing. And I think telling those stories does mean that we need storytellers, and it would be unfair to expect the African Tourism Board to be the only agency that tells these stories. Who do you expect, in addition to yourselves, to be telling these stories? And how do you encourage Africans themselves to evangelize or to speak about their own experiences on the continent? Because I've heard people saying that I've been so impressed by what I've seen in Africa. But when I listen to people coming from Africa, I get a different story. Mm-hmm. We almost have nothing to say about our own continent. So it seems. So maybe you can help unpack for us, what is it that we can say that is good about our continent, and what do we do to change the attitude that the people have, that they hardly ever feel the need to testify and give testimonies of just how good Africa is, despite the fact that they experience on a daily basis. And charity begins at home. And if we don't say anything good about our continent, should we be expecting the rest of the world to say something good about us? So what is your view? I've got other questions, but maybe we can start there. What is your view on who should be telling this story, and what is the story that they should be telling, and how do you encourage ordinary Joe Soap to actually be telling those stories and not to leave those stories to a powerful agency like the African Tourism Board?
Yes, I strongly believe that the best comes from Africa. At one stage, I was actually in the UK, Birmingham Hospital. When I got there, I realized that almost 30% of specialized doctors, they are from Africa. And that on itself, I've been flying. I mean, I was surprised when I flew even Qatar Airways. You sit there, you see your Nollywood. They are actually entertaining us in those international flights that do not even belong to Africa. That on its own, when you stand at the airport, when you look at the tourists coming through, like we are here in South Africa, where I think most of the GDP being contributed through the tourism space. The majority are Europeans and the Chinese communities. That on its own is a signal that tells you that there is nothing in the world, there is no continent that can come even closer to Africa, that can surpass what Africa has. During the COVID-19, it came as a blessing when the global community closed their borders to Africa. We were left to fend for ourselves. It was a turning point to start our internal discussions as Africans, where we said, no, charity should begin at home. They have closed their borders. What are we going to do now? We need to open up avenues, discussions among us ourselves. That's your domestic focused tourism, where we are saying we need to involve the whole value chain. Domestic tourism, community-based tourism, where the focus is to say, how do we bring brand ambassadors from the grassroots to the top? As I've indicated, that we have so much to offer. And I was talking to our colleagues in Tanzania, where it's perceived that tourism is now surpassing the Valley of Gold in terms of their generating revenue. So that on its own, it says it must start with our domestic appreciation. Who are we as Africans? How do we start to appreciate our cultural diversity? How do we start to appreciate our heritage as Africans? When we talk about heritage, when we talk about culture, we get it from our townships, where our chiefs are integrated within the mainstream of tourism. We need to appreciate. I still believe that there's no continent that can come closer to Africa. Africa is the best. All what we need to do is to really look within ourselves, start to appreciate who am I as an African, and move away from actually living and existing under the shadow of the so-called civilized communities. So it must start with us. Each citizen must actually start to appreciate and be a brand ambassador of their destinations.
Okay. I don't think anyone would disagree with you that Africa is the best. But where people might become skeptical would be on Africa is the best at what? Because it seems like Africa has always been the best at supplying the world with raw materials. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt about Africa being the best at that. There is also now, based on your experience in the United Kingdom, no doubt that Africa is the best at supplying specialists, intellectual capital. So we're not just talking about Africa supplying natural raw materials. We're also talking about Africa supplying human capital. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So Africa is the best at that. But as the African Tourism Board, what do you want Africa to be the best at?
Chief, we are saying, yes, you have said Africa is known by supplying our raw materials to the exterior world. That must come to a stop. We need to have leadership that have the best interest towards building the economy, building their destinations. Yes, change does not come easy. change is painful. We have looked, when you look at West Africa, they are doing quite a lot, especially in developing themselves. Burkina Faso, we need to move from our comfort zone and stop the issue of really being taken advantage of by the international community. We need to start saying, how do we really stop this issue of supplying our raw materials? We need to have our own refineries in Africa. We have so much to offer. Actually, even in our educational structures, it is so sad that we still depend on what we inherited from those who actually made sure that Africa stays at the backdrop of the economy, backdrop of the educational systems. So we need a system that will drive the change that we need to see. And we have said, we have partnered with the African Union where we've said, look, I think it's time for action. When you look at the Agenda 63, which I believe that Agenda 63, I think all of us, we won't be alive by then. How do you have a long-term goals without focusing on the your medium term, your current term, so that you start now to implement? Our focus as the African Tourism Board is to say, as much as we are in discussion with member states to see how best they can collaborate one another, how best can they start appreciate. By the way, God made Africa in such a way that we complement one another. What South Africa does not have, Lesotho has. We're actually talking about the snow in Lesotho. It's like we're in Russia. And that's Africa. We complement one another. Until we realize our worth as a continent, until we realize our worth as Africans, and once we realize, we'll be able to compliment and appreciate your neighbor. You don't treat your neighbor as your competitor, but as somebody whom he is complimenting what you have. So yes, we still have a long way to go, but change should happen. And I'm glad that, look, you don't expect all 54 member states, but you focus with those who are ready to make change. And I can see the wind is blowing. Fortunately, it's blowing from the western region of our continent.
Yeah, no, thank you, Chairman. There are some who are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about the credibility of organizations that represent African interests, such as the African Tourism Board, the African Union, the African Peer Review Mechanism, and others. And the reason for these questions stems from, for example, you've mentioned Agenda 2063. And Agenda 2063 was engineered or proposed by leaders and politicians within the African Union who knew very well that they don't have to account at that time, because a child born today would almost be 40 years old in 2063. So it's almost giving Africa a target that is so far into the future that it is pie in the sky, because things change every day. With AI now, we don't even know what the world will be like in 5 years' time, let alone in 40 years' time. So it is very clear that it's not only an unreasonable target, it is one that lacks ambition. And some people are starting to say, hang on a minute, who actually funds the African Union? Isn't it funded by the European Union? Isn't some money from the USAID? Isn't the money that funds the African Union actually from agencies that are interested in the status quo, in which extractive practices could continue? And perhaps you could speak about your own organization in terms of its funding, because there is quite a strong perception now in terms of the agency of organizations on the continent that they are agents of the West, that they are not necessarily agents of African interests, because how could you have something like an African continental free trade area? And to be serious, if we're talking as adults, nothing has happened. I mean, unless you have the resources to trade, you have the people to trade, but nothing has happened. I think there's increasing attention now towards claims and perceptions that the majority of African organizations, starting with the African Union, are probably agents of the West. And perhaps speaking about your organization, how is it funded, and how would you deal with this kind of skepticism when people look at the track record of continental organizations?
Yeah, firstly, let's address the issue of various bodies that are actually, coming up from each and every angle. Our African Union, the vision was so good, and the objectives were so right. The problem that we have, we are so segmented as a continent, and we always view each other with so much skepticism, and that has created a gap that needs to be actually bridged. And that's where, remember, once Africa stands as a one body towards one objective, it is the end of Europe, and it is the end of the United States, and that's a fact. And they will make sure that they will keep us apart as a continent. If you look at the history of that beautiful body, and I've always said that if our Julius Nyerere would actually come out of their graves and be afforded time to walk around the African Union, what is it that you have achieved? What is it that you have implemented? It would be a big cry, because we are so segmented. The African Tourism Board, by the way, briefly, both of us, we used to be at the UNWTO, where I actually served for 2 or 3, 4 decades, and under the auspices of the former Secretary General, Dr. Talib Rifai. We realized that the objective was not to bring Africa within the same space of the global community. The focus was Europe. The focus was Asia. Africa, they got so excited because, of course, of the affiliation fees. They pay a lot of money to be an affiliate member of UNWTO. But what is it that we are getting as a continent in terms of value? It is zero. So we thought, no, it cannot be business as usual. Let's see how best we can change the status quo. Hence the formation of the African Tourism Board, to say, let's have a voice that will bring together all the tourism boards across the continent, a voice that will definitely advocate for Africa to come together as member states and fight our own battles as member states. And hence the formation. I'm glad that even the former Secretary General, he is part of our board. Yes, he sits in our advisory team. So our objective, we are a membership affiliated organization. Yes, we have created strategic partnerships with organs like your Afrexim Bank, who actually have realized, the need of joining forces with like-minded organization that pushes the agenda of Africa. So yes, and we host numerous conferences that actually focuses on investment towards Africa. where we're saying, as much as, of course, we need international global investors. We have spoken about the free trade area, where we haven't seen much of its impact, but discussions are there. And I believe that it's the start and the beginning of greater things to come. But we need the will and the drive from all strategic partners, especially the private sector and the public sector. We need to work when policies are developed, policies that will enhance Africa to be where it's supposed to be. We need initiators on the ground. That's your private sector, the doers, the implementers. So yes, we strongly believe that something good is happening. And as I indicated, that at times we are so comfortable in our comfort zone, and change can be painful. Change can bring tears and sweat, but ultimately it plays a lot of good dividends. Imagine a situation where Botswana would have their own refineries in Botswana, where they extract their minerals. It's refined there. Imagine a situation, Democratic Republic of Congo, they make sure that they refine. When we sell to them, let us sell a complete.
Yeah.
Yes. So there should be a will. Africa has so much to offer. So as African Tourism Board, our focus is to say, let's come together. Let's have one objective. I have attended some of your WTMs, World Tourism Market, where you get all the African countries under one roof, but there is no dialogue among us themselves. And we have said as African Tourism Board, this affords you, be it in London, it affords us opportunity to come, where we see CEOs from various tourism boards speaking with one voice. What is it that you have done so well? Rwanda, when you look at your mice, and you are doing extremely well. What is it that we can pollinate from you? We don't see that voice. So that's our emphasis, to say, let's start to develop mechanisms that will also assist us. At one stage, we have mining in Indaba, in Durban, I think it's in May, annual event, where we said, look, it's good to have mining in Indaba. It's good to have WTMs that have been brought to Africa. But at the end of the day, it's not our event. It's a European event. They realized that there is a niche market in Africa. That's why they created all these mega conferences. Why can't we come together as a continent and have our own mega events where we speak to one another? That's the acceleration and adding value to the free trade area, where we're saying, let's see how best we can move and trade among us ourselves. Yes.
Well, there are many in the United States that would take issue with the statement you make that if Africa gets organized, that would be the end of them. I think there would be an impact, but certainly not the end of them. And neither would that be the end of, for instance, the United Kingdom or parts of Europe. But there would be an impact, definitely. But what I take from that statement is something that gets mentioned often, but not sufficiently clearly enough in order for it to have the impact that I think it deserves, is that for as long as Africa is disorganized and disconnected like it is now, it will be exploited. To the extent that there is lack of effort in implementation of African initiatives, AU initiatives, African country initiatives, that is fertile ground for exploitation. And therefore the sustenance of instability, whether it's political instability or it's just wars and unrests on the continent, actually makes the continent, is fertilizer for exploitation. And to that extent, the fact that the various agencies, especially the African Union, do not seem to be doing anything to recognize the fact that these situations seem to promote the continued exploitation of African resources, including its human capital, needs to be discussed further, because it comes at a cost that the continent cannot afford. Which brings me to my next question about implementation and resolve to implement decisions. I know that the African Union, through its African peer review mechanism, cannot enforce any decisions that it takes. The African Tourism Board would, for instance, have, say, South African tourism as a member, and Namibia tourism, Botswana tourism, Malawi tourism as members across the continent. But similarly, one would imagine that you do not have the capacity to enforce any measures, and that seems to be a problem. In terms of the African Union as a template for African continental bodies, for example, where you have human rights abuses, the African Union cannot actually enforce those, force those countries to desist from certain practices. In fact, it seems to not pay particular attention to those things. And then you have a situation where what should be a condition for membership, such as the promotion of human rights, free speech, free press, is actually optional, and member states can practice or not put those things into practice. And the question then being, what can you as an African Tourism Board do, for example, to promote the storytelling, the problem solving, the global competitiveness, the self-love, the patriotism, the organization of success as per what can you do to cause some kind of enforcement to take place? Because people in Botswana might be saying, oh, African Tourism Board, we'll just do our own thing.
It's so exciting. I think firstly and foremost, we need to pause. African Union as a bloc, they cannot actually implement sustainable mechanisms because these are so segmented leaders. It's a group of cowboys who come together, and I don't know why we do not learn from your EU's organs who are so objective and represent their constituencies. And I still believe that, look, it's deliberate that Africa is kept so segmented in the state where it is now for the benefit of those who are benefiting. They create commotion. The wars that are being fought in Africa, it's a man-made challenges. Where it requires objective leaders who can see beyond and realize, we have said on our offset, on our discussions, that you can only stand up when you realize your worthiness, when you identify yourself on who you are. What we have appreciated as African Tourism Board, it has to be per member states. They need to come up with mechanisms. And we are so glad that with a number of member states that we have engaged with them, looking at Malawi, Namibia, I mean, quite a lot of good changes happening with the new dispensation. We have had meetings with the authorities there, and in our strive to see how best we can actually also create conducive environment for them to say it must start with you. Don't look at other member states. When you look at Botswana as well, there is a lot of change that is coming. And we have said, look, there is a revolution that is coming in Africa. And that revolution we can actually witness and testify. Burkina Faso's who have stood up and said, look, let's create this thing. Let's get rid of these French guys who have been actually taking advantage. It's working. If it works there, it can work anywhere. Look at, Rwanda, which, it's really a case study. It's a case study where they really develop their own economies. We need to start somewhere. So our discussions as African Tourism Board is to motivate, and also is to make sure that we also add value in terms of bringing Africa to those destinations, to say, let's see how best we can move. We are so glad that during the intra-Africa trade in Egypt, that was 2023, where African Tourism Board, actually, we had side events, investment dialogue, where we brought a number of ministers to say, let's talk to one another. There is a gentleman, he is an advisor to President Putin in Russia. When he realized, our program, he was so excited. The next thing, we were actually invited to collaborate with them, where on their annual event in Travel Russia, where it brings together the whole region of Russia under one roof. And the big cry was, how best can we start working with Africa? There is a lot of potential in Africa, which he said Africa is open for business, but it's under our terms. We don't want to go back where people, they come to Africa, they exploit. And we, at one stage, when the embassy of China was being constructed in Pretoria, your bricklayers were from China, everything was China. We said, you cannot allow such situation. If they come in, it has to be on our terms. So I still believe that, look, something good is happening in Africa, and the private sector should play a pivotal role and actually put so much pressure to our public sector to say, please, let's start somewhere. Let's start to build. And we're using tourism as a catalyst tool that brings us together, that breaks the divide. And tourism, it's a sector that does not need a passport. It transcends, it crosses the borders, and hence these discussions where it's going to be flashed all over the world. That's part of tourism. So we believe that if we use tourism as a tool, there is so much that we can actually enjoy and actually pollinate and expand and build from there. Yeah. But the focus has to be within the domestic sector.
Fantastic.
Yes.
No, that's that's awesome. I share and I empathize with a lot of what you are saying. Us as the African Genius Awards, our belief is around narrative ownership. I think because of the history of colonialism or apartheid, there's a tendency to outsource the narrative to certain institutions and bodies, especially political bodies or government or large institutions. And by right, I think our perception is that the narrative should be owned by individuals. It should be owned by the community. Each person should have that have it within themselves, the desire for Africa to succeed. And hence we recognize individuals like yourselves that have excelled in the spaces where you operate, because those individuals manage to overcome history. They manage to overcome chains around their legs, their hands, their necks. And they manage to still forge ahead and make success of the little that they have and get noticed. And we believe that these can be a blueprint for other institutions such as the private sector that you talk about, but also for those that are in positions of organized leadership such as bodies, associations, and government. And perhaps like what you've been saying, that when it comes to domestic tourism, a lot of emphasis needs to be placed there. We can talk a lot also about the mobility of Africans, the inability to afford to go to the coast. A study that we did show that a substantial percentage of South Africans have never been to the coast, for example, despite it being on average less than 600 kilometers away for most of them. But that's an issue for another day. So that's why I think our organizations are working together, and thank you for agreeing to partner with us, because you got this bigger picture, this access to larger organizations and entities, and we're coming from the point of view of exceptional Africans that have demonstrated in their own individual spaces an ability to perform and create those stories that the African Tourism Board can tell. We were speaking to one of the nominees yesterday, a university professor, an African that is a scientist, and we were quite amazed by his achievements in science. And that is sort of material that can constitute the kind of stories, apart from motivating students, learners, the youth, to also aspire for higher goals. So I really appreciate the discussion around ownership of the narrative. Perhaps your organization can clarify going forward how you can help the general public to play a bigger role in owning the narrative, as opposed to the victimhood mindset. Because what we find in Africa is that victimhood does not have an expiry date. So all right, we were colonized. Okay, it was 400 years ago. Okay, it was only in 94. It was only, but then you have countries like Singapore that in a period of 25 years, or Paul Kagame in Rwanda in a short space of time, or Sheikh Mohammed, who in the United Arab Emirates in a short space of time again has transformed the United Arab Emirates, and so a victim very often doesn't have any achievements. That's the unfortunate thing about being a victim. When you are a victim, your only achievement is being victimized. So perhaps in terms of ownership of the narrative and going forward, what role could an organization such as the African Tourism Board play?
Oh, yes. No, thank you so much. We have always maintained that Africa is not an isolated continent. We are part of the global community. What we need to do is to position ourselves. Our stories, our narratives have been actually, it's unfortunate as well, when you look at the media fraternity, it's owned and controlled by a few. And those very same guys who control the media fraternity, they control how you report Africa. And I have said, I indicated that when you look at some of the gruesome crimes that are committed in Africa, they are not actually magnified as much as I remember at one stage, should be 2 or 3 years ago, we had an incident, I'm sure it was around Mpumalanga, where one of the British, is it an American tourist, was killed. And it was on headlines for almost a week. And to the extent that they even issued a statement, they said, please, Americans, be cautious when you travel to South Africa. But when you look at what's happening behind their closed doors, it's scary. There are places that you are not supposed to be traveling daylight in the United States, and also in Birmingham, as I indicated, in the United Kingdom. So it's our stories. We magnify positives. I've always said you need to look on the other side of the coin. Look at the positive, learn from it. But flip the coin, you have got so much positivity. We need to be able to pollinate from Singapore. We need to be able to pollinate from Rwanda. We need to be pollinating from all these guys who are making it well within the whether economic space or within the tourism space. We need to learn. And also, we emphasize on our domestic appreciation. It must start. If imagine a situation where everyone here in Johannesburg appreciates tourism, appreciate themselves and their brand ambassadors, it will accelerate even our GDP contribution that will actually flow in, through the tourism space. So as African Tourism Board, we really appreciating those who are doing well. We are saying how best can we learn from them. And also we are creating dialogues. I was talking to my sister that we've got an investment summit that is coming up in Mozambique in the next few weeks, where we actually, emphasis is to bring the Continental strategic partners to come. And we go beyond the Caribbeans. That's where your diaspora, our brothers and sisters, to say, come back home, come and explore opportunities in Africa. So that's our emphasis. And throughout the year, we are rolling out programs in each member state where we create awareness, where we're saying, let's have trainings, which is very, very much important. We need to train our people to be self-sufficient and also to respect who they are. They are superhuman beings. I always pride myself by I'm glad that God created an African in me, because I'm not an afterthought. So once we have that realization, what God has given us, we are doing most of the work. We appreciate our brothers. Remember, black, white, pink, yellow, red is like your lovely garden at home. When you have roses, some they're white, some they're pink, some they're blue, and some they're white. That's how God created this universe. Black, white, bringing them together. But unfortunately, we have been victims. So we need to move away from being victims. We are victors on ourselves. We need to position ourselves and identify areas where, as a starting point, reshape ourselves and be part of the wider community.
That is Cuthbert Ncube, the chairperson of the African Tourism Board. Really appreciate your time, and just to go out on a positive note, I want to go out and tell a positive story. You are in the business of telling positive stories about Africa. What story can I go out and tell my friends and I can say to them, this story is approved by the African Tourism Board?
Let's rise and shine. Let's rise and shine. And by the way, I want us to start. It's all about collaborations.
Yes.
African Union, they cannot do it on their own. They have failed, unfortunately. All what they need is strategic partners who can come in and identify areas, loopholes, working together. As a body, we cannot actually achieve what we want to achieve. We need to collaborate with entities like your entities. You are doing a splendid work in acknowledging and appreciating those who are actually doing well within their space. That goes a long way. So we need to come together, collaborate, and join hands, synergy, in driving our African agenda. I still say African child must rise up. The value chain comes down to our primary to secondary university. We need to have syllabus in our schools that educate worthiness. The history must be changed. Let's teach our young ones our own history. What do I benefit in learning the American history while I'm in Africa? So we need to start to appreciate on who we are. Let's give them good substance education that will bring up independent and dependent individuals. change is painful, but change has to be done. Change has to come. So together, collaborating, we can actually move mountains.
I appreciate that, sir. Thank you so much. And we are going to be going out there telling the story about Africa, a good story about change that is imminent, but change that we need to engineer and change that we need to be a part of through collaboration between the private sector, the public sector, as well as other entities that are involved and interested in the development of the African continent. Once again, thank you so much, Cuthbert.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much.